Ladies and gentlemen, the folks that were circling around trying to figure out who was going to make the speech for Newt can relax. They won't have to do that now. How many times do people get up and say, we're going to introduce somebody that needs no introduction? Well, if y'all don't know who he is, you're in the wrong room. He's, I think this is a record for the number of people turning out for breakfast. So, Newt, we're proud of you, and we're glad you brought us a crowd. I've known him for about 22 or 23 years, and a much younger history professor came in to see me one time and said he wanted to discuss his most recent campaign, which he'd lost. And we talked about that. And he lost another one, and he came back, and we talked about it again. And then the next thing you know, he's won, and he's been winning ever since. There are a lot of triumphs and tragedies over those 22 or 23 years, and there are two constants that I can testify to. The first time that I saw Newt, he had goals, and he had achievable, marketable goals, and he went after them very tenaciously and has accomplished them one at a time as they come. The other constant is maintaining his friendships. And it's a great pleasure to introduce a great leader, great honor, my friend, Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
Thank you very much, Rogers, for that introduction, and I want to thank you and Hank McCamish for having me here again this morning and give me a chance to talk about what we have done and what we have to do. I was thinking about friendships and those goals, and Sam Roberts was a JC leader when I first got active a long time ago, and through two defeats, he allowed me to use the basement of his house as a campaign headquarters or a place to sleep or a place to meet or whatever we needed, and finally we won, and now he's a state senator, and as I look around the room, there are all sorts of folks who have, over the years, been very, very much part of this movement and who have both provided personal help. Senator Tysinger and I go back, I think, to when I was in college at Emory, and he was active creating what was then looked like a long, distant hope, or the Republican Party in Georgia, something which has truly come to fruition over those years. So I'm delighted very much to be here and to have a chance to share some ideas with you. And I see over in the corner there one of the best public speakers in Georgia, President Floyd Filani of the college, which has been very, very good to me. And I just want to say it's great to be here with him and to know how, again, a personal friendship, things that grow and develop over the years. And you look for these kind of things, and you come to treasure. And so I appreciate very much the chance to be home and to have a chance to share both what we have done, which I think is pretty remarkable, and what we have to do, which I think will prove to be a considerable challenge. And institutions like this play a great role because you are a Georgia-focused institution. You are part of a worldwide movement, and you are part of an effort to create greater chance to pursue happiness, and yet you do it with a focus on our state and what needs to be done here at home. And as you develop good ideas, as you know, on a number of issues, they start here and they move around the country, and they happen across the whole society. And so there's a very powerful synergism between big ideas all around the world, specific ideas in Washington, and in almost every state now there's a program much like this one, which is developing local ideas or county-level ideas or volunteer ideas. And I think it's that kind of a ferment and that kind of a creativity which is making an enormous difference and beginning to help us move towards the 21st century. What we have done, I think, is pretty remarkable. 4 years ago, a very small group of leaders in a minority, 38 years in the minority, at a time when the news media told us that we were going to have the largest tax increase in peacetime history, and we were going to nationalize health care so the government controlled everything, and we were going to have left-wing social policies, one of which tragically led to a dramatic increase in drug use in this country because of laxity in teaching our children. The net result of that was we clearly were going to become a society different than the society we're becoming, because the American people stood up in 1994 and said no. They didn't want to go in that direction. They repudiated it. And because a relatively small group of people were willing to write a contract with America and were willing to stand by that contract, and at a time when we were told that 30-second negative commercials were the only way to campaign, we were willing to take out an ad and TV guide that was totally positive. We were willing to outline a set of issues that were totally positive. We had the largest increase in off-year election history. 9 million more people voted Republican, and 1 million fewer people voted Democrat. And for the first time in 40 years, there was a majority on the conservative side in the House. Then we worked for 2 years at keeping our word. And we accomplished a great deal, far more than was sometimes obvious in the blizzard of misinforming ads that you saw on television. But in fact, we did pass a bill to apply to the Congress every law that applies to the rest of the country. We did pass a bill, excuse me, to reform the telecommunications system, which will create, we think, about 3 million new jobs. We did pass a bill which ended the agricultural entitlement in the Midwest, which is now being phased out. And we did pass a welfare reform legislation which ended 61 years of federal entitlement to welfare and dramatically improved the opportunity for poor people to move from welfare to work and from poverty to prosperity. And then last week, we put the capstone on what we promised 4 years ago. We reached an agreement on a balanced budget by 2002 with lower spending and lower taxes. And let me make this very clear, because there seems to be some confusion. Almost there's an opposition conservatism which has been opposed for so long that if we achieve something, their first question is, what's wrong with it? It's almost like they can't celebrate. It's like being in the locker room of a Super Bowl winning team and we won by 1 point and they go, yeah, but that's not big enough. Let me tell you what's in this agreement so you'll understand why I say we have already done a lot. First of all, spending over the next 10 years compared to current law will be $1,100 billion lower than it would otherwise have been. Taxes will be a net of $250 billion lower over the next 10 years than otherwise would have been. We have the President's agreement that he will sign a capital gains tax cut, that he will sign a cut in the death tax, and that he will sign a $500 per child tax credit. And all of those will be passed into law before he gets a penny of additional discretionary spending. Our goal is to pass all of this by the 4th of July so we can give America a birthday present. To give you a sense of the scale of how big the change is, the Medicare proposal the President has agreed to is $6 billion less in spending than the bill he vetoed. That is, we compromise to the right. Now, this is one more step towards a smaller federal government, more decentralization back home, more volunteerism, a return to the values that have made America successful. Last week, in 1 week, and many of you will have read the articles about the fact that we haven't been doing much and this Congress has lost its nerve. In 1 week, we did the following. We passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which I believe our Superintendent of Education, or the Chairman of the Board will tell you, will be worth about $3.5 billion to state and local boards of education because it reduces the opportunity for trial lawyers to file nuisance lawsuits and it reduces dramatically the amount of paperwork. That was passed both in the House and Senate, will be signed by the President. It was a tremendous creative compromise that brought together the education community and the disabilities community to cut out the trial lawyer community. And it was a very good step in the right direction. Second, we passed a reduction of 60 federal bureaucracies on vocational and adult education to 3 block grants, eliminating 57 layers of federal paperwork, 57 federal offices, 57 sets of federal bureaucrats to get the power back home so state and local governments can be involved directly. Third, we passed in the committee the balanced budget agreement I just outlined. It passed 31-7 in the House Budget Committee on Friday with 11 Democrats voting yes and 7 voting no, and all of the Republicans voting yes. Fourth, we passed a Housing Reform Act, which will dramatically improve our ability to manage public housing and begin to return power and opportunity to the poor and begin to modernize it. And it does include a work requirement. I want to make this clear. It does not recruit a compulsory volunteerism requirement, which is nonsense. It's bad English. Compulsory volunteerism is work. I mean, the left has picked up on volunteerism as their new term, and I just want to make it very clear. Compulsory volunteerism is work, and a government employee volunteer is a bureaucrat with a T-shirt. So we passed real housing reform. Finally, in addition to all of that, from a Republican standpoint and a conservative standpoint, we won on Tuesday a seat in New Mexico which no Republican had ever held before. And for the first time in history, the entire New Mexico House delegation is Republican. As a seat which is 2-to-1 Democrat, it's Bill Richardson's seat, the new ambassador to the UN. And I can assure you, had a liberal Democrat won a seat that was that Republican in the middle of troubles in a Republican administration, it would somehow have been page one and talked about for 4 days. But we are very proud of the fact that, given a choice, the American voters voted for a Republican in New Mexico. And by the way, that increases our margin by 11%, from 9 to 10 seats. So we had a particular interest in that. Now, one other thing about this balanced budget agreement. And you all have, I think, a handout which you can look at later on, which talks about economic growth, and I commend you to take it home because it really does have many of the basic pieces of data. This balanced budget amendment has a low, not a high, economic assumption. That is, it only assumes we continue the weak Clinton level of growth, which is 2.2% a year. Let me tell you the difference. The national average growth rate for 70 years is 3.2%, a full percentage point more than we're growing right now. If we get to that level, we balance the budget in 2001. Just because more people at work, more incomes, more revenues, that's a virtuous circle. If we were to grow at the Ronald Reagan level, which was 3.9% a year, you balance the budget in 2000. If we were to grow at 4.6%, which is the John F. Kennedy level, you balance the budget next year. Now that's the power of growth, which is why we're taking several key steps, one of which is to establish a committee in every congressional district dedicated to abolishing the death tax on the premise that people should not be discouraged from saving for their children and grandchildren, and small businesses and family farms should not have to be sold just to meet the tax collector, and you should not have to go to an IRS agent and the undertaker in the same week. It is profoundly wrong. Let me also point out that in California, when this issue was clearly on the ballot, 65% of the state voted yes. So you can win the argument for eliminating the death tax, largely because in California, they pointed out, the people who pay the most for it are the working poor who lose their job when the family business is sold. So this is an anti-job, anti-worker, anti-savings, anti-family position, and my commitment is that we abolish it, not just improve it, get rid of it. It is bad tax policy. Second, we're going to establish in every single congressional district a committee to abolish the tax on savings and job creation, which is called capital gains. Alan Greenspan has said it is the most destructive single tax that we have, that it does more to kill economic growth than any other tax. And I think we can win the argument with the American people that economic growth, job creation, more take-home pay, higher quality of life is important, and we ought to have a tax code which encourages job creation, not a tax code which punishes job creation. So the commitment to economic growth and to eliminating bad taxes is a major part of our future. In addition, in the paper we're handing out, you have an address. For those of you who are already savvy to the internet, one of the steps this Congress has taken under Republican leadership is to make the entire Congress available to any citizen without a bureaucrat or a lobbyist or a subscription. We literally on Friday put the budget agreement on the internet. It's available on my homepage, and it's available through the Thomas system at the Library of Congress. Any citizen in America can access it and can print out or load down on their own computer the entire agreement, the entire legislative package. They can know it as soon as any member of Congress and as soon as any Washington lobbyist, and they can read it without it being edited by anybody else. And it gives us a chance, I think, to create a genuine grassroots understanding of where we're going, and is one more example of what we're trying to do. Yet, I want to suggest to you the greatest lesson of the balanced budget is not economic. It is the fact that 4 years ago, leaders set out to work with the American people on something the American people believe in. And that if the American people and leaders who are disciplined and consistent and are willing to take a beating from their opponents work together, that the constitutional system works. Yes, it takes time, but that's the way the Founding Fathers designed it. Yes, it is frustrating, but again, the Founding Fathers were afraid of dictatorship. They wanted to design a machine so inefficient that no dictator could force it to work. The corollary is that sometimes it's very hard for us to get, as volunteers, to get it to work voluntarily, but that's fine. The fact is it is working. And I believe that we have three great challenges of the future that if I've outlined for you what we have done, I want to now outline for you what we have to do over the next few years. Imagine a January 1, 2001, the first morning of the 21st century, the first morning of the new millennium. It happens to be a Monday morning. Imagine that on that morning you were to wake up in an America that was, for all practical purposes, drug-free. An America in which every child was learning at their best rate, and an America in which children were born into marriages capable, or families capable of taking care of them, because we had ended the long process of teenage pregnancy outside of marriage. Now, how much healthier would that America be? Let me just repeat those three, because they're three clear, definable achievements. An America that is, for all practical purposes, drug-free, an America in which virtually every child is learning at their optimum rate, and an America in which girls don't get pregnant outside of marriage as teenagers, and there is an expectation that children will be born into families capable of raising them. How much healthier and how much better would that be? And I know the first time you hear that said, it sounds like one more politician offering some big goal that will sound good, but nothing will happen. But I came here today to say something very different. We have proven over the last 4 years that if you take something seriously and you stay focused on it and you work at it every day, you can achieve it. It's not just a campaign slogan. It's not just an idea. It is a fact that this summer we're going to pass the implementing legislation for a balanced budget. It is a fact that you will have tax cuts in your next tax report that is different than you had a year ago. It's the first tax cut in 16 years by the federal government. And so when we sat down and said, what do we have to do? What's our obligation for our generation? We decided we don't want these as campaign issues in 2000. We don't want these as things to talk about. We want to establish a national set of goals of the three things we owe it to our children to do for this country. And we felt these were the three most important. Now, when I talk about getting them done, I am not talking about a new federal government bureaucracy. I'm not going to give you a weekly speech on the latest minor idea with a small set of bureaucrats to do a tiny thing. I don't think the federal government can achieve these three things. I think if it could have, it would have by now. But I think the American people can achieve these three things. This is a great country filled with good people. And the fact is, whether it's as volunteers, whether it's in our churches or synagogues or mosques, whether it is in our neighborhood communities, whether it is acting as individuals or in our businesses, whether it is in our school board or our city council or our county commission, whether it's in our state government or our federal government, whether it's in our broadcast media, we have many resources to bring to bear to make this a better country above and beyond the federal bureaucracy. And so I'm talking today about dedicating the country in exactly the tradition that Tocqueville talked about in Democracy in America in 1840. When he said it wasn't the Constitution, it wasn't the government, it wasn't the politicians, it was the spirit of individual Americans working on an individual basis at a community level across the country that made America so remarkably different from Europe, a spirit which Marvin Olasky caught in his great work, The Tragedy of American Compassion, where he pointed out that bureaucrats who simply redistribute money cannot save people. And that in the 19th century, when we had a much lower tax system, much higher take-home pay as a percentage of income, we had one volunteer for every 2 poor people. So if the volunteers knew who was the alcoholic, who was the drug addict, who beat their children, who was worthless and needed to be retrained, and you had a much higher level of human-to-human contact, and that is the spirit that I believe we have to reestablish. Now, there are a lot of indicators, frankly, that good things are happening. I want to give you just a couple of examples. When William Bratton became head of New York's Metropolitan Transit Authority in 1990, he acted decisively. He banned panhandling, removed graffiti, and arrested fare beaters, a large number of whom turned out to be carrying weapons, as people who jump over the machine in order to get it on without paying their subway fee. The felony rate in the subway fell by 75% under Bratton's leadership, a result that has been called unprecedented in the literature of criminology. Then Bratton took over the New York City Police Department in 1994, applying the same principles and attacking disorderly behavior, aggressive panhandlers, and squeegee men. By the end of 1995, people were less likely to be victims of robbery or murder in New York City than at any time since the early 1970s. And Bill Bennett told me on Friday that the actual violent crime rate had dropped 50% in New York City in the last two and a half years. Now, it's important for two reasons. Here's our largest city, and they're getting it done. But second, if the principles work, what we have to do is get every community to understand the principles. And we have to stand up firmly in favor of principles work. Pragmatism, the original American philosophy, is very simple. It's applying common sense. If theory and reality don't fit, choose reality. And Floyd can tell you that you can see in that one sentence why I was in so much trouble on a college campus. But let me suggest to you that this is the core challenge intellectually and mentally about where we're going. Can we stop drugs? Yes. Can we stop drugs with a liberal bureaucracy and a social policy and an intellectual theory that's wrong? No. Can we have every child learn? Yes. Can we have every child learn in a failed bureaucracy dominated by tenure and unionized work rules with an education theory that doesn't work? No. Can we save young girls from getting pregnant? Yes. Can we save them in a liberal bureaucracy with the wrong social policy, with the wrong theory of how society works? No. So this is essentially an intellectual argument. What is the nature of reality? Now, I think there are signs, frankly, that people are beginning to get it. Joseph Califano was one of the designers of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. In a recent magazine article, he reports that on a tour of drug treatment centers, every single ex-drug addict he talked with said that religious belief was the key to their recovery. Quote, "I don't see anything wrong with public funding for a drug treatment program that provides for spiritual needs," says Califano. "If that is what an individual needs to shake cocaine, to shake alcohol, to shake heroin, we need more of that kind of thinking." This is a man who would have been a Great Society liberal. But he's at least willing to recognize that the reason Alcoholics Anonymous works is it starts with the notion you have to recognize you have a problem inside you, and you have to understand that it takes a higher being in order to solve that problem. I've had a number of recovering alcoholics tell me they've been approached by federal officials to say, could we do an 11-step program? And skip that part about God. And they say, I don't think you quite get what makes this work. But again, there's a simple test. If we reinforce drug rehabilitation that works and cut off drug rehabilitation that fails, what we're going to find ourselves doing is helping institutions that are faith-based and eliminating secular institutions that are bureaucracies that simply don't save anybody but absorb money. We will save more people per $1 million the faster we move the resources to faith-based centers, but this is going to be a big intellectual argument, and it's going to be a big power struggle. Because a lot of folks who aren't doing any good, but who are doing well, not doing very good, are not going to like. Some people may have wondered why I would make one of the three major challenges of the next few years ending pregnancy outside of marriage for young teenagers. And I have to say, first of all, that Kay Granger, the former mayor of Fort Worth, who is a freshman member of Congress, really convinced me of this. She has a YWCA program in her city, which has 800 at-risk girls. They statistically should have 70% pregnancies, 560 pregnancies in this particular group. They have 2. And she said, you have to understand the cost. Here, the United States, according to the New York Times, has the highest teenage pregnancy rate in the world, in the industrial world, rather. among all the industrial nations in terms of outside of marriage. Here are some of the costs. 50% of the girls who have babies out of wedlock will be long-term welfare recipients. 70% of all juveniles in state reform institutions were raised in fatherless homes, and now rates of illegitimacy are past 50% in 7 of our 20 largest cities. Some numbers the President used that I think are very sobering. A child born into a single head of household family will have 140,000 social transactions by the time that they are 4 years old. A child born into a family with 2 parents will have 700,000 social interactions. That is, learning how to speak, learning how to talk, learning how to read, learning how to interact. Think about the difference. Think about that child at Head Start, the child who's had 140,000 social interactions, and the child who's had 700,000. And then we try to play catch-up with government employees at that point. Now, the answer is not, as our liberal friends would say, what we need is a bureaucrat at the crib and a bureaucrat at prenatal care and a bureaucrat who teaches them how to speak and a bureaucrat who stands next to the parent and watches over their shoulder. What we need is to reestablish the healthy social patterns and the healthy social programs and the healthy principles that for most of American history simply made common sense to most people. And one of them is, if you're a young boy and you get a girl pregnant, you have a responsibility. You have an obligation. Another is to reach out to girls, particularly poor girls, and give them an understanding that they can have a better future. The program in Fort Worth at the YWCA emphasizes the motivation of the young girl, the integrity of the young girl, the chance to be ambitious for the young girl. Because she sees herself with a better future, just saying no makes sense, because there is a life beyond one evening. And it's very important to give people who are poor an opportunity for a better future and a belief in a better future, because it changes their time horizon. Drugs and teenage pregnancy are in large part a function of the breakdown of our society's belief that every person has the right to pursue happiness. And if we reestablish that belief and make it real for the poorest children of America in the poorest neighborhoods, you will see a dramatic change in behavior, because hope precedes discipline. And people, once they have hope, will begin to discipline themselves. One of the examples of this effort, and again, this is not a federal program, but I, as Speaker of the House, and all elected officials, I say to my friends here who are in public office, all elected officials are societal leaders, leaders of their people, who happen to be involved with government. And our ability to lead our people is more important than fighting over legislation or fighting over bureaucracy. And so take the example of Best Friends, Elaine Bennett's program. It's an abstinence program for 5th to 12th grade girls. It's now in 50 schools in 15 cities. Each year, each girl gets at least 110 hours of adult attention, discussing problems, gaining skills, learning self-confidence. In 9 years, out of 600 girls who participated at least 2 years, there have been just 2 pregnancies. Now, I would challenge anyone to find a government program with a similar result. Because the fact is, when you volunteer, you give of your heart and your time and your soul, and you are engaged. When you write a check to the IRS, you think you've bought permission to ignore the health of your country, and you haven't. And so we have an obligation to reestablish lower taxes with more take-home pay, so we can then turn to every American and say, if America has been good to you, it's time for you to find a fellow American to be good to. And that's the spirit that will truly save every young person in the next generation. Let me also suggest here that what is at stake here goes far beyond simply the concept of waking up in a drug-free society with everyone learning at their best rate and with young children being born into families that can take care of them. This is about the very fabric of America. It's about what we're going to become. And it's doable. And I really want to come back to this point. I am not today giving you a set of slogans for a nice political campaign. I am suggesting to you, as the Speaker of the House and one of the leaders of one of our 2 great parties, that we should at every level in this society make these 3 things happen by January 1 of 2001. Now, we know we can bring about great change because we are bringing about great change in welfare. Let me just give you the example. In 1 year, nationwide welfare caseloads have dropped by 18%. They have fallen in every single state except Hawaii. 650,000 people left welfare in just the 4 months after we passed the reform. The fact is, people left welfare before the bill became effective, because the word was on the street: go to work, get off welfare. And you literally could talk to welfare workers who will tell you they could, once the news media began to describe it, once it began to penetrate the common dialogue, once people discussed it over coffee, behaviors began to change. The law followed the behavior change, but the act of debating the law led to the behavior change. In Wisconsin, where welfare reform has been far advanced because of the great leadership of Tommy Thompson, they reduced those on welfare by 33% in 1 year, and the welfare rolls in Wisconsin are over 50% lower than they were when Tommy Thompson first became governor. And that brings, by the way, you take the money we were spending on people who could go to work, and you now have more money to spend on the truly hardcore cases where it's going to take a tremendous amount of coaching. Don't kid yourselves. There are people in this country who need a tremendous amount of coaching to be able to get off of welfare. And that's not illegitimate. It's not because they're bad people. If I can use a very mild example, I stand here today weighing a lot less because I've had a lot of coaching. I'm not sure I could have gotten here without a lot of coaching. All of you have things you have to do, or somebody has to help you, whether it's filling out your taxes or learning to repair your car or getting your house painted. And we shouldn't look down on somebody else who might need coaching because they've never gone to work for the first time, or they've never learned on the job, or they've never served a customer. But if we'll get in the common habit of coaching each other, we'll be a healthier, better, a happier society. And that's what's happening with welfare reform. And it's beginning to be recognized. Here's what the New Republic, the bastion of modern liberalism, said. Quote, this is from an editorial in the New Republic. So far, it seems, the logic behind welfare reform was right. Now that the incentives have changed, welfare recipients are making better decisions. Liberals who oppose reform speak of the poor as if they are irrevocably crippled, lost forever. But as we've learned over the last 6 months, the problem is much simpler. A small core of people need tremendous help, but the large majority seem to need only a small shove. That is the best news we could have hoped for. Now, that's from the New Republic. So I just want to say to you, you're seeing real change in welfare. You're seeing real change in government spending. You're about to see a real change in taxes. And so if we talk about, let's go ahead and create a drug-free America with every child learning at their optimum rate, with children being born into families that can nurture them, these are just the next wave of changes in a pattern that we began in 1994. And the reason this is happening is because we are part of a worldwide movement of freedom and faith. Now, you may think that sounds grandiose. Those of you like Sam who knew me a long time ago, or Rogers, you know that if I'd wandered in your office and said this when I was getting beat the second time, you probably would have had some reason to not believe me. But even now, as Speaker of the House, you may not fully believe it. So I brought a Washington Post article. Part of this is actually in the packet at your seat. This is an article from April 6, 1997, from the Washington Post now, not from Republican propaganda. It says, this is the headline, "In Mongolia, a GOP-style revolutionary movement." The subheadline is, "Republican-inspired contract help end communist rule." I'm just going to read you the opening 2 paragraphs. Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. On a stool in his portable felt and canvas yurt, Yadam Surin, a 70-year-old nomadic sheep herder, offered a visitor chunks of sheep fat and shots of fermented mare's milk to ward off the unspeakable cold. 70 miles of bleak desert northeast of Ulaanbaatar, and many miles from the nearest neighbor, he spoke glowingly of the work of House Speaker Newt Gingrich and the Republican Party. Now, I'm not making this up. This is by Nate Thayer, who's a Washington Post writer. And here's what Yadam Surin said, quote, "I read the contract with the voter closely. Everybody did," he said, explaining why he decided to vote for a new government in Mongolian elections last June. In the contract, they clearly say what society and the people can do for each other. Now, what happened was one of Dick Armey's staff went to Mongolia as part of the International Republican Institute, met with the opposition parties, organized a coalition, taught them how to write a contract. Their contract is different than ours. For example, running water was a big plank in the Mongolian conflict. Hasn't been a major plank in Georgia since the 1950s. But those of you who are old enough to remember there was a big plank. So it's not, again, the whole human race is moving in the same direction, but at different speeds and at different objective conditions. They printed 350,000 copies of the contract. They distributed them by camel, horse, truck, and car. It is the widest distributed document in Mongolian language history. 91% of the people voted. They elected a 43-year-old speaker, a 41-year-old prime minister, a 30-year-old majority leader, and half the members of the legislature are under 35. And they're clearly part of a worldwide movement, which is privatizing Social Security in Chile, which is privatizing the post office in Denmark, which is dramatically overhauling the government of New Zealand, which is changing things in Buenos Aires, which now has a private water supply, which is less expensive and healthier. There are things happening around the world, and we are part of that process. We are a worldwide movement of faith and freedom. We believe that if you combine the wisdom of the Founding Fathers with the opportunities of the information age and the world market, that everyone has an opportunity to pursue happiness. Now, as a historian, I know people have changed their countries more than governments have changed their countries. The greatest example is the rise of Wesley and the Methodist movement in Britain in the 18th century. Those of you who are Methodists or who are historians may be very familiar with the story, but literally the Wesleyan movement, by reaching out across Britain, by saving souls, by reducing dramatically the number of people who were using gin. And there was literally a crash in alcoholism among the industrial poor because of the Wesleyan movement. It not only saved Britain from the Industrial Revolution, but it set the stage for one of the, not from the Industrial, but from the French Revolution. But it saved the people of Britain both from political turmoil and from a tremendous amount of pain. And it set the stage for one of the great achievements of modern times. Because one of the most amazing stories in all of history concerns how the institution of slavery, deeply rooted in the practice of millennia, was virtually eliminated in 100 years, becoming maybe the greatest achievement of the 19th century. The abolition movement began in the minds of a small group of religious people in England called the Clapham set. Its leaders were Henry Thornton, a wealthy banker and one of the fathers of monetary economics, and William Wilberforce, a Methodist and a member of Parliament. Their goal was to change the laws of England and abolish the slave trade. Their method was an amazing information campaign. Researchers associated with the group interviewed witnesses and gathered information on the horrors of slavery. Pamphlets were published. Actual specimens of leg shackles and whips were displayed to the public. A boycott of slave-produced sugar was organized. The opposition in Parliament was strong. 56 members of Parliament had a direct financial interest in slavery. But after 20 years of defeats, they won in 1807, the beginning of the end for slavery around the world. Historian Thomas Macaulay, whose father was a member of the Clapham set, recounted, "The truth is that from that little knot of men emanated all the Bible societies and almost all the missionary societies in the world, the African Institution and the Anti-Slavery Society. They were really the destroyers of the slave trade and of slavery." Changes in sentiments and beliefs create the conditions for legal reform, and that leads to changes in government, which are also necessary. It was, after all, the Royal Navy that actually suppressed the slave trade after it was banned. Not prayers, but ships. But it is the prayers which made the ships possible. Government action makes a secular reality out of a moral and spiritual movement. And that's really the framework for what I am describing and where I think we need to go. Now, when I said we can combine the wisdom of the Founding Fathers with the opportunities of the information age and the world market so that every person on the planet has their God-given right to pursue happiness, let me share with you something I learned only 2 weeks ago at the Library of Congress, which has a wonderful display of the institutions, the treasures of the American collection, part of which is Jefferson's personal library. There's a book there from Jefferson's own collection by Henry Hume, Lord Kames, called Essays of the Principles of Morality and National Religion. I'll just repeat this because it's not what you think of a modern politician reading. A book entitled Essays on the Principles of Morality and National Religion. Here is a quote underlined by Jefferson that I want you to think about because it will change how you have thought about one of the most common phrases in American political history. Quote, People have an innate sense of right and wrong. When they act virtuously, they increase the general happiness of mankind. Thus, the pursuit of virtue and morality is the pursuit of happiness. Let me repeat that. When we talk about we're endowed by God with unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and Jefferson replaced what John Locke had written, the pursuit of property. Jefferson replaced it with the pursuit of happiness. But here is the meaning as underlined by Jefferson's own hand in a book in his library. Thus, the pursuit of virtue and morality is the pursuit of happiness. Now, doesn't that place that in a rather different light than, say, situation comedies or much of modern theoretical thought would imply? And doesn't that sort of suggest that the core principles of the American system are remarkably faith-based? That there's a reason that Washington's first inaugural and Washington's farewell address are replete with references to God and morality? That there is a reason the Declaration of Independence begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident? That we are endowed by our Creator? That we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor? That Lincoln 12 times in the second inaugural, 12 times refers to God or the Almighty in explaining American history. That Jefferson at his memorial has around the top of it, I have sworn upon the altar of God Almighty, eternal hostility against all forms of tyranny over the minds of man. And that to get to a drug-free America where every child is learning and where children are born into families that can raise them does require a faith-based society and a society that returns to its roots. Now, this may seem like big, grandiose goals. But let me cite for you why they are very American, to have goals that are in fact larger than you'd think. Historian George Nash points out that the Great Seal of the United States was adopted by the Continental Congress in 1782. We weren't yet a free country. On one side is a majestic eagle. The other side, less familiar, is the unfinished pyramid with the date 1776 in Roman numerals on its base. Below is the motto, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. Self-conscious break with history, identified with the hopes and the futures of mankind by design and intention. Nash adds, hovering above the pyramid is a symbolic, unblinking eye, the eye of God. And placed there is another motto, Annuit Coeptus, meaning he has favored our undertaking. I believe if we will return to that which has made us a unique country, if we will recognize that we are a great nation filled with good people, if we will call upon all of those people, not the federal government, not the bureaucracies, not the law, but all of our people in all of our communities, we will in fact awake on January 1, 2001 to a country which is virtually drug-free, in which practically every child is learning at their best rate, and in which children are born into families that can actually raise them. And I believe those three tasks have to be done, and when done, we will be able to say to our children, we have given you a country which is economically in order, which is socially in order, and where we have reestablished the framework of freedom, and now it is your generation's turn to lead the rest of the human race to that kind of a promised land. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Ron. Rogers has told me I will take questions, so I'm still here. But those of you have to go to work, I understand. Yes, sir. My Congressman John Lillard has said that he would like to draft a bill to a flat sales tax and do away with the IRS as we know it. Realistically, what's the possibility? Well, I think we're working right now, as soon as we get the budget done and the tax bill done, we're working to have Congressman Bill Archer and Congressman Dick Armey launch a nationwide dialogue. Dick Armey favors replacing the IRS with a flat income tax. Bill Archer favors eliminating the income tax and replacing it with a sales tax. I think that should be a national dialogue, and we're trying to work out a schedule where people will go around the country and have this debate between those two choices and let the country think it through and let the country decide which one of those two they like. But I believe our commitment is in the not very distant future, I think it'll take a Republican president to sign it into law, where I think we can abolish the capital gains tax and abolish the death tax even under Clinton, because I think we could override his veto. But I think to go to either a flat tax or a sales tax as a replacement for the income tax will require the election of 2000, when I hope we'll have a second contract and we'll have a team that's running on the contract. Yes, ma'am. Well, it could. But it could also statistically eliminate liberals, since by definition, if you eliminated tenure, they'd have a lot more of them at risk. And I think it also depends on who the presidents of the universities are and how the Board of Regents operate, or whether it's a public or private university. I think, but I would go at it from a different angle. We are moving into an information age when the hierarchy should be based on merit and on knowledge. It shouldn't be based on credentialing or on tenure. And I think that there are many steps we can take to reestablish the idea that if you know and if you perform, you ought to be rewarded. And if you don't know and you don't perform, you shouldn't be rewarded. And we should recognize that the original concept of tenure, which was protection from political pressure in a world where there were very few universities and they were very small, is probably not nearly as relevant an issue in an age of massive university and college structures. And I think that, frankly, tenure is an idea whose time has passed, and is one, just as I'm for term limits, and I've committed myself voluntarily to a limit as speaker, and I think we ought to have term limits for members. I think that we ought to also recognize that no one should have, by right, the ability to draw on everybody else for income without performance. And I think that that's just a key part of the information age. Yes, sir. Well, Tony Blair, first of all, moved dramatically to the right. I mean, Tony Blair ran almost as much as a conservative as John Majors. Majors had, for a number of years, failed to follow Margaret Thatcher's principles. I mean, it would be a little bit like, you know, if tomorrow morning we decide we didn't care about a balanced budget, didn't want to cut taxes, and weren't all that big on welfare reform, if we got defeated, you could hardly call that a defeat for conservatism. The fact is that Blair, for example, Paul Johnson, who's a former socialist, probably the most brilliant intellectual in England, Paul Johnson had been Margaret Thatcher's advisor. He's now Tony Blair's advisor because he found John Majors was not willing to think about ideas. And so I think you really have a situation where, now whether or not Blair is real, I don't know. But the other part of this is the sheer weight of the world market in the information age. In the information age, as all of you know, means that small businesses have huge advantages of agility over big businesses. That's just a fact, which has huge implications for school systems and government bureaucracies, et cetera, because they lack the agility to function in the information age. That's true everywhere in the world. It's turning out to be true in Germany. I mean, Helmut Kohl recently spent 3 days in New Zealand studying privatization, which is unthinkable in Germany. I mean, even the conservatives can't raise it because the German social contract is so strong with the unions. But the fact is they're going broke. I mean, being a unionized unemployed member is not as exciting as it sounds. And so, and this is frankly the problem that the AFL-CIO faces. 43% of the AFL-CIO members are government employees. I mean, they are no longer in touch with the economic realities of the market. And what we have to do is really work our way through. We want government to operate. I'll close with this, but I want you all to think about this because it's a great test. I want government to operate with the same effectiveness and the same customer orientation as the private sector. And you can measure this in your own head. If you walk into McDonald's, you have a second hand on your watch. If you walk into a government office, your watch moves in 15-minute increments, and I'll bet you every one of you has psychologically succumbed to the distinction. You have a level of patience in dealing with a government bureaucracy which you pay for, that you do not have in dealing with a private sector as a customer, which you pay for. Now, you're paying for both of them. And why should we tolerate one rhythm and one attitude in the public sector and a totally different rhythm and attitude in the private sector and have it be the private sector that's doing better? I mean, the whole theory of the progressive reforms at the turn of the century was that government was supposed to be the leader. Well, guess what? Bureaucracies protect themselves. It's true in big companies. It was true at GM until Toyota came along. It was true at Ford. But when the Japanese got really good and the market really brought pressure, the auto companies started to change. It was true at IBM until Microsoft showed up. You have a much more agile, and those of you who are here from IBM I think will agree, there's a much more agile IBM today than there was 10 years ago. When AT&T was faced with breakup, they suddenly said, oh, there is a marketplace. So guess what? Our movement has to say to every institution of public life, we want you to learn from the information age. We want you to learn from entrepreneurship. We owe our country the best services we can give them for the price they pay. And I think if we bring that attitude, we'll reestablish civil service, we'll reestablish professional pride, and we'll have people who are eager and delighted to be part of serving the public. Thank you all very, very much.